October of 1861 arrived early in the upper Bitterroot Valley. The wind coming down from the eastern ridges already carried the sharp bite of mountain winter, and the grass along the slopes had turned a dull yellow. The color that meant frost was no longer a warning. It was a sentence already passed. Micah Boone stood silently on the barren hillside, with one hand holding onto his 8-year-old son, Eli. Ahead of them yawned a black basalt cave carved deep into the mountainside. Behind them, along the narrow wagon trail, stood Conrad Pike, the older brother of Micah's late wife, gripping the reins with a face colder than the mountain wind itself. Beside him sat Ruth Pike, her eyes carefully avoiding Micah's. "There ain't room for you on Pike land anymore, Micah," Conrad said, his voice rough with contempt. "The cabin down in the valley belongs to me, but this cracked stretch of hillside here, along with that hole in the rock, that was Sarah's inheritance from her folks. I'm giving it back to you. It was a cruel division. A barren strip of land, black stone, a cave most men only used long enough to wait out a rainstorm. You're sending a child up here to die before the first heavy snow even falls," Micah said quietly. There was no anger left in his voice, only exhaustion. "The one who sent people to die was you," Conrad exploded, years of buried hatred finally breaking loose. "You let my sister freeze to death in that rotten timber shack. I ain't letting you poison my land another day." Conrad snapped the reins sharply. The wagon turned back toward the valley without a single glance behind. Eli pressed himself tightly against Micah's coat, both hands buried deep in the rough wool fabric. Beside him, the old brown hunting dog Rook moved slowly around the cave entrance, sniffing the cold air drifting out from the darkness. "Pa," Eli asked softly, his voice trembling, "we really gonna live here?" Micah did not answer right away. He did not watch the wagon disappear down the trail. Instead, he watched the wind. A thin current of cold air slid across the cave mouth, then bent strangely inward along the eastern wall before vanishing into the darkness beyond. Conrad Pike's hatred had not come from nowhere. The previous winter had killed Sarah Boone slowly, not with a blizzard, not with starvation. Pneumonia had done it instead. At the time, Micah and Sarah had been living in a damp timber cabin built along the edge of Pike Ranch property. Micah had raised the place with his own hands, but he could not outbuild the brutality of the Montana Territory. Smoke collected beneath the low ceiling. Wind slipped through warped wall planks. Wet blankets never fully dried. The fire always burned hard, yet the warmth never seemed to remain once the flames settled down. Timber leaked heat no matter how much wood a man fed into it. Sarah often woke in the darkness, coughing beneath 2 quilts, while frost spread slowly across the floorboards beside the bed. One night, near the very end, she looked at Micah and spoke so quietly, it almost sounded like an apology. "This house stays cold from the floor upward." Micah remembered those words more clearly than the church bells ringing at her funeral. Conrad never forgave him for the poverty and failure that led to her death. And Conrad was not the only one. In Bitterroot Valley, the Pike family held enough influence to shape the attitude of the entire settlement. People began looking at Micah differently after Sarah died. In their eyes, he was no longer a grieving widower. He was a failed man, a husband too poor and too incapable to keep his own family warm through winter. Whispers spread from the blacksmith shop to the general store. Suspicions slowly hardened into quiet contempt. By the time Conrad finally drove Micah away from the ranch, most of the valley had already turned its back on him without ever saying so aloud. Truthfully, Micah had never forgiven himself either. Some nights he still remembered sitting beside the fire holding Sarah's hand while the room remained cold around them. The flames kept burning, but the warmth never stayed. That was why Micah never begged Conrad to let him remain at the ranch, and why he never asked the townspeople for help after being cast out. He had lost faith in thin wooden walls, and perhaps a little faith in people too. If winter had already taken his wife inside a house, he was not about to let it take his son the same way. Leaving the past behind him, Micah carried the burning torch deeper into the cave while Eli stayed close behind him. The darkness thickened fast, but the cold did not. That was the first thing. Outside, the October wind cut through wool and skin alike. Inside, the air stayed still, heavy, dry. Rook circled once on the basalt floor, then lowered himself onto the stone without shaking. Micah crouched and pressed his palm against the rock. Not warm, but not winter cold either. He lifted the torch slightly and noticed something else. Along the eastern wall, a narrow crack in the basalt was pulling the smoke sideways instead of pushing it back into the cave. The mountain was moving air somewhere beneath the stone. Behind him, Eli slowly sat down against the wall. 10 minutes later, the boy had fallen asleep. Micah looked at his son, then back toward the black basalt walls surrounding them. For the first time since Sarah Boone died, a strange and dangerous thought entered his mind. Stone might be able to hold what timber never could: warmth. 2 days later, Micah rode down into Bitterroot Crossing to trade for lamp oil and salt before the first heavy frost sealed the upper roads. Edna Crowley, the widow who controlled most of the valley's winter credit ledger and supply trade, watched him from behind the counter while writing numbers into her winter ledger. "A cave's fine for a bear-come snow season," she said loudly enough for the room to hear. Never heard of one fit for raising a boy. Nobody laughed outright. That made it worse. A spoon stopped halfway to a man's mouth, near the stove. Somebody shifted boots against the floorboards. Eyes followed Micah without staying on him long enough to feel impolite. Micah said nothing. He bought 2 coils of rough rope instead, then an old stone pick with the handle worn smooth from another man's hands. At the back of the store, Pastor Eli Mercer watched the exchange quietly beneath the brim of his black hat. Outside, Eli climbed into the wagon beside his father. As they pulled away, 2 boys near the hitching rail whispered the words just loud enough to carry. "Cave fool." Micah kept driving as though the wind had said it instead. Leaving the mockery of the general store behind, Micah decided to seek out Gideon Vale, a reclusive, weathered trapper rumored to be the only man in the valley who truly understood the breadth of the mountain. The trail to Gideon Vale's place followed an abandoned trapping route north of the basin. Micah found the old trapper splitting cedar beside a low stone shelter built half into the hillside itself. Gideon looked nearly as weathered as the mountain behind him. Long gray beard, one bad shoulder sitting lower than the other. Eyes that studied a man the same way experienced hunters studied ice on river crossings. Micah mentioned the basalt cave. Gideon stopped swinging the axe. For several seconds he said nothing at all. Then he asked quietly, "That cave still breathing?" Micah frowned slightly. "Breathing?" "The mountain pulls air through it." Gideon drove the axe into the stump. "Always did." Inside the shelter, the old man spread rough charcoal sketches across a work table scarred by knife marks and burn circles. He explained slowly, using plain words instead of grand theories. Basalt held heat longer than timber. Deep ground temperatures stayed stable because winter only touched the surface layers of earth. A proper cave system could trap warmth without burning half a forest every month. But airflow mattered more than fire. Always airflow. "A cave ain't a cabin," Gideon said. "Cabins leak heat. Caves trap everything. Warmth too. Smoke too." He pointed toward a narrow vent drawn into the stone. "If the draft turns wrong, the mountain keeps the poison with you." Micah listened without interrupting while winds scraped against the outer rocks beyond the shelter. At last, Gideon leaned back in his chair and stared toward the dead spring outside. "This mountain has no room for pride," he said flatly. The words came out evenly, like something repeated enough times to lose all drama. Smoke rolls backward after midnight. Snow seals the upper vent before dawn. If you ain't careful, the mountain will turn that cave into a tomb. He rubbed one rough hand slowly across his beard. "Smoke don't kill fast," Gideon said quietly. "It lulls a man to sleep in the warmth. That's what makes it dangerous." Carrying the old trapper's haunting warning back to the mountain, Micah immediately threw himself into the grueling work of reshaping the cave. For the next 6 days, Micah Boone worked from first light until the mountain disappeared into darkness. He cut lodgepole pine along the lower ridge and hauled the trunks uphill one at a time using rope harnesses across his shoulders. Eli gathered moss and wet clay from the creek bank below the slope. Old Rook dragged smaller branches beside them, with a line tied loosely around his chest. Slowly, the cave mouth began to change shape. First came the drainage trench, cut along the eastern edge to carry meltwater away from the entrance. Then, the double timber throat wall, narrow enough to trap heat, wide enough to let smoke travel upward if the draft held steady. After that, Micah fitted flat shale slabs above the fire pit to force rising heat deeper into the chamber instead of losing it straight upward. By the seventh night, he tried the first real fire. For several minutes it worked. Then the wind shifted outside. Black smoke rolled backward through the throat wall so suddenly that Eli woke coughing beneath the blankets near the basalt bench. Rook barked once and backed away from the darkening air. Micah smothered the fire with dirt before midnight, eyes burning so badly he could barely see the cave walls. The stone around them turned cold again, almost immediately. Long after Eli finally stopped coughing, Micah stayed awake listening to the boy breathe in the darkness. For the first time since reaching the mountain, he wondered whether Conrad Pike had been right all along. Gideon Vale returned 2 mornings later, carrying nothing except a rawhide satchel and a length of burned pine used for testing draft flow. He listened while Micah explained what had happened with the smoke. The old trapper did not touch the throat wall, did not move the fire pit, did not offer quick answers. Instead, he crouched beside the ashes and pointed toward the dark stain above the shale shelf. "Watch what the smoke tried to do," he said. For nearly an hour, he made Micah study the cave itself. The direction of the draft, the wetness gathering along certain sections of basalt, the narrow angle of the eastern vent shaft. The speed smoke traveled once it reached the throat wall. Slowly, Micah began noticing the real problem. The cave was not failing to create heat. It was bleeding heat away faster than it could hold it. That afternoon, he widened the drainage trench and filled part of the floor with coarse gravel to pull moisture downward instead of letting dampness spread through the chamber. Then, he added a second shale lining behind the throat wall and lowered part of the sleeping area ceiling with cedar poles and hides to trap rising warmth closer to the basalt bench. The next fire burned smaller, steadier. By midnight, the stone behind the bench held enough warmth to dry Eli's socks beside it. At 3 in the morning, Micah woke suddenly and reached toward the fire pit. The flames were already dead, but Eli still slept warm beneath the blankets. Even Rook had moved away from the ashes to sleep against the basalt wall instead. The strange warmth radiating from the mountainside would sooner or later draw the curiosity of those in the valley below. 3 days after the first successful fire held through the night, Nolan Reed came up the ridge carrying a burlap sack of dried venison over one shoulder. The young ranch hand stopped talking almost immediately after stepping inside the cave. Most men expected caves to feel colder once sunlight disappeared behind them. This one did not. The air stayed still, dry. The kind of dry warmth usually found near brick ovens after bread had already been pulled out. Micah noticed Nolan staring at the basalt bench beside the wall. "Go ahead," he said. Nolan pressed one hand carefully against the dark stone. His eyebrows lifted before he could hide it. The bench had been soaking heat from small controlled fires for 2 straight days. Not hot enough to burn, just warm enough to keep cold from settling into the cave floor after sunset. "That ain't possible," Nolan muttered quietly. Micah did not answer. Rook barely bothered, lifting his head from the wall, where the old dog slept far from the fire itself now. For nearly an hour, Nolan walked through the cave, asking short questions about airflow, drainage gravel, and the shale lining above the throat wall. By the time he left, something inside him had already started changing, but he never returned the next week, nor the week after that. Micah understood why the moment he saw fresh Pike Ranch feed wagons moving south through the valley road below, winter credit decided loyalties long before truth ever did. That night, Eli sat beside the fading fire and asked softly, "Nolan, hate us now?" Micah stared into the red coals for several seconds before answering. "No," he said quietly. "Winter just makes people afraid." The valley's invisible fear quickly turned into grim oppression in the weeks that followed. By early November, Edna Crowley stopped pretending her prices were changing by accident. Lamp oil cost Micah nearly double what it had 2 weeks earlier. Salt came in smaller sacks. Whale oil disappeared from the shelves entirely whenever he entered the store, and every conversation somehow drifted back toward the same subject. A boy sleeping underground all winter, Edna remarked one afternoon while balancing figures inside her ledger book. Territory officials hear about that sort of thing sometimes. The room went quiet again after she said it. Not hostile. Worse than hostile. Careful. Micah never argued, never defended himself. He simply found other ways to pay for what he needed. One morning, he repaired a broken wagon axle behind the blacksmith shed. The next day, he spent 4 hours patching cracked harness leather for a cattle hauler heading east before snowfall closed the mountain routes. After that came wood splitting, fence posts, iron hauling, anything that traded labor for supplies. Pastor Eli Mercer saw him one evening outside the forge yard, still swinging an axe long after sunset. Blood had opened across Micah's palm where the handle rubbed through old calluses. He kept working anyway. Above them, winter clouds were already building over the eastern ridges. Back at the cave, Eli carefully pushed his worn boots farther beneath the blankets before Micah returned that night. The left sole had nearly split open. The boy did not mention it. As November deepened across the Bitterroot Basin, the cave slowly stopped feeling like a place people hid inside. It began feeling like somewhere built to remain. Micah finished the long basalt bench first, stacking river stones behind it so the rock could absorb heat through the evening and release it slowly after the fire burned down. Then came the raised sleeping shelf made from cedar poles, lashed into the stone wall above the coldest ground air. A narrow bypass vent followed after that, carved carefully through softer shale to keep draft pressure moving even when canyon wind shifted outside. Near the rear chamber, Micah stretched a drying line between 2 iron spikes hammered into basalt. For the first time in months, wet clothes dried overnight without freezing stiff before dawn. Eli noticed everything. He learned to listen to the sound of air moving through the vent shaft while lying beneath blankets at night. Learned which sections of stone stayed warm longest after sunset. Learned that strong airflow carried a lower sound through the rock than weak airflow did. Rook seemed to understand the mountain best of all. Whenever weather shifted beyond the ridge, the old dog moved automatically toward the eastern vent and stayed there listening. One evening, Micah hung Sarah Boone's old gray wool sweater beside the basalt bench to help dry it fully before winter deepened further. Neither he nor Eli mentioned it afterward. The sweater simply remained there, near the warmth like another quiet part of the shelter. Long after midnight, Micah woke briefly beside the fading fire pit and looked toward the sleeping shelf above him. Eli was asleep without coughing, without shivering. For the first time since Sarah died, the boy looked completely warm. Conrad Pike came up the mountain during the second week of November, carrying a rifle across one shoulder and enough suspicion to fill the valley below. He claimed he only wanted to check on Eli. Micah let him inside without argument. Conrad stood near the cave entrance for several seconds, studying everything in silence. The stacked firewood under canvas coverings, the drainage trench cut carefully away from the throat wall, the narrow vent shaft disappearing upward through black basalt, the layered shale lining fitted above the fire pit. He did not praise any of it, but he did not laugh either. That alone meant something. Eli sat near the basalt bench eating venison stew from a tin bowl while Rook slept beside the eastern wall. Steam drifted slowly upward through the chamber instead of choking the air. Conrad's eyes followed Micah as he lifted a small iron kettle from beside the fire. The water inside had frozen thin across the top overnight. Instead of building a larger blaze, Micah simply slid the kettle against the heat-soaked basalt stones lining the bench. Within minutes, the ice softened and broke apart. No wasted wood, no roaring flames. Just stored heat moving slowly back into the metal. Conrad watched the process longer than he probably realized. Most frontier men judged shelters by size, by smoke, by how hard the fire burned. Micah was measuring something else entirely now. Heat kept, fuel saved, air controlled. At one point, Conrad stepped closer and rested one rough hand briefly against the basalt bench itself. The stones still carried warmth from the previous evening. He pulled his hand away without comment. But when Eli asked for another bowl of stew a few minutes later, Conrad looked at the boy carefully for the first time since entering the cave. And some of the fear inside his face finally eased. The canyon wind changed direction sometime after midnight. Not gradually, violently. Micah woke to a low growl deep in Rook's throat before he understood what had happened. The old dog stood near the eastern vent with his ears flattened and nose pointed toward the darkness above. Then Micah smelled it. Smoke. Thick. Wrong. Heavy with wet ash. Eli started coughing almost immediately from the sleeping shelf. Micah lunged toward the fire pit and saw black smoke rolling backward through the throat wall instead of climbing upward through the shale shelf. The draft had reversed completely. Outside, wind slammed against the mountainside hard enough to shake loose dust from the cave ceiling. The upper vent shaft had frozen. Micah wrapped a scarf across his mouth, shoved open the outer timber flap, and climbed into the storm, carrying the iron pry bar. The cold hit like a hammer. Snow blasted sideways across the ridge, so fast it barely looked like falling snow anymore. It looked alive, white streaks tearing through darkness. He reached the vent opening half-buried beneath wind-packed ice and dropped to his knees beside it. Smoke pulsed weakly upward through a narrowing gap no wider than his fist. Not enough. Inside the cave, Eli coughed again. Micah attacked the ice barehanded after the pry bar slipped from his grip and vanished downslope into the dark. Frozen shale shredded the skin across his fingers almost immediately. Wind shoved against his back, while snow slid loose beneath his boots near the edge of the ridge. One bad step would send him straight into the ravine below. He kept digging anyway. At last the blockage cracked apart. A hard sucking sound rushed upward through the shaft as the mountain pulled air correctly again. Smoke vanished from the cave throat almost instantly. Micah stumbled back inside, half frozen, hands trembling uncontrollably from the cold. Eli was still coughing beneath the blankets near the basalt bench. For a long time afterward, Micah sat beside him in silence with one arm wrapped around the boy, while stored heat slowly returned to the cave walls. Outside, the canyon wind kept screaming through the dark, like something angry the mountain had refused to let inside. The next afternoon, Micah rode north through light snowfall to Gideon Vale's shelter and told him everything that had happened with the frozen vent shaft. The old trapper listened without interrupting. No surprise crossed his face. No disbelief either. When Micah finished speaking, Gideon remained silent long enough for the cedar fire between them to collapse inward with a soft shower of sparks. Then he nodded once. "Now you know why I understand the draft the way I do." The words settled heavily inside the small stone shelter. Gideon stared toward the doorway where pale winter light leaked across the floor. "Winter of '39, I thought I understood canyon wind better than the mountain did. Built the shelter too tight. Fire held heat real good." His voice grew quieter after that, carrying a grief buried for decades. But it held the smoke good too. And that's exactly how my grandson died. Outside, wind brushed dry snow against the rocks, with a sound like sand moving across wood. Gideon finally leaned forward and pushed another cedar branch into the fire. "Most men freeze because they lose heat," he said. "But that boy died because I kept the wrong things trapped inside." Micah thought about the black smoke rolling toward Eli's bed in the darkness, only hours earlier. Thought about how close the mountain had come to sealing all three of them inside that cave forever. Frontier wisdom suddenly looked different to him then. Not magic, not old mountain superstition. Just knowledge bought slowly through mistakes, harsh enough to bury the men who made them. For a long moment, Gideon said nothing more. He never once looked directly at Micah while speaking about the boy he had lost. 3 days after the vent nearly froze shut, Gideon Vale climbed halfway up the ridge and stopped beside the outer wall without even entering the cave. "The pressure's dropping too fast," he said. Micah looked toward the valley. At first, nothing seemed different. Then he noticed what Gideon had already seen. No deer movement along the lower tree line. And strangest of all, the wind had gone quiet, not calm, waiting. By afternoon, dry snow drifted across the mountain in thin gray streams that looked less like snow and more like ash blowing from some distant fire. Micah wasted no time after that. He hauled additional river stones into the cave to increase stored thermal mass, filled every spare bucket and kettle with water before the creek locked under deeper ice, reinforced the throat wall with a second timber brace. Then he packed snow tightly against the outer structure itself, building a crude layer of insulation around the exposed entrance, where canyon wind struck hardest. Even Eli noticed the difference. His father moved faster now, spoke less, checked airflow every hour. That evening, far below the ridge, Conrad Pike rode through the lower pasture checking cattle fences, while storm clouds built over the eastern divide. To him, it still looked like another hard Montana winter. Nothing more. Micah no longer believed that. Near sunset, he dragged two heavy support beams across the cave entrance and fastened them into place diagonally against the outer wall. Eli watched silently from beside the fire. It was the first time he had ever seen his father reinforce the shelter, as though preparing for something strong enough to break it apart. Outside, the mountain remained unnaturally still, like a man holding his breath before delivering judgment. The White Divide storm arrived during the night with almost no warning at all. One moment the mountain stood silent beneath low clouds. The next, the entire basin disappeared behind moving walls of white. Snow did not fall. It attacked. Wind drove frozen powder sideways across the ridge, hard enough to shake the outer throat wall, like a living thing trying to force its way inside. The canyon beyond the cave turned invisible before dawn. Trees vanished. Rock vanished. Sky vanished. Only the screaming wind remained. For 3 straight days, the storm buried the upper Bitterroot Basin beneath drifting snow deeper than a man's shoulders. Inside the cave, Micah Boone fought constantly to keep the system alive. Every few hours, the eastern vent threatened to freeze shut again beneath packed ice. He slept in short intervals beside the throat wall fully dressed, waking whenever airflow changed pitch inside the shaft. Sometimes the mountain breathed low and steady through the basalt. Other times, the draft narrowed into a dangerous whistle that meant ice was building somewhere above them. Each time, Micah climbed into the storm to clear it before smoke could trap itself inside the chamber again. The cave shook under canyon winds so violently during the second night that loose shale dust drifted from cracks overhead into the firelight below. Eli slept wrapped in blankets beside the heat-soaked basalt bench, while Rook pressed himself tightly against the boy's outer side, blocking the cold air slipping down from the entrance every time Micah opened the outer barrier. The fires remained small. That mattered now. Not roaring heat, controlled heat, stored heat. Micah rotated warmed river stones near the sleeping shelf, while steam rose slowly from drying clothes, stretched along the rear chamber line. Water buckets stayed unfrozen. The throat wall held. The gravel drainage bed kept the floor dry despite melting snow, tracked inside on boots and blankets. Outside, the world ceased to exist beyond the cave mouth. No birds, no wagons, no cattle bells. Only white wind hammering the mountain without rest. On the third night, Eli stirred briefly beneath the blankets, while the storm roared through the vent shafts overhead, like distant iron wheels racing through darkness. Then the boy fell asleep again beside the warm basalt stone, while winter tried and failed to break its way inside. The storm finally loosened its grip sometime near dawn on the 4th day. Not completely. Wind still moved across the upper ridges in long, hollow bursts, but the violence was gone now. The mountain no longer sounded angry, only exhausted. Micah stepped outside the cave carrying the iron mattock and stopped in silence. The upper Bitterroot Basin had vanished beneath snow. Drifts stood chest-deep across the lower slope. Entire pine fences disappeared beneath white mounds shaped by canyon wind. Even the wagon trail leading toward Pike Ranch had become nothing more than a faint depression twisting through the valley. Micah looked downslope instinctively toward the distant ranch buildings. No smoke. That troubled him immediately. A week earlier, he had noticed the Pike Wood rack already running low before the storm arrived. Conrad had expected the weather to pass quickly, same as every other hard winter season before it. Now 3 days of buried chimneys and frozen wind stood between that confidence and survival. Behind him, Eli pushed aside the blanket hanging across the throat wall entrance. The boy did not ask what Micah was thinking. He looked toward the valley once, then toward Rook, lying awake beside the warm basalt bench. Both of them understood enough already. If Conrad's alive, Micah said quietly, almost to himself, he won't have strength left to dig out alone. He stood there another long moment listening to the weak wind crossing the snowfields. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, Nothing that clean. He simply knew one thing, with certainty. Eli would someday become the kind of man shaped by what he saw his father do during hard winters. Micah did not want the boy growing into a man who remembered that people had been left to die within reach of help. Without speaking, Eli walked back toward the sleeping shelf and returned carrying the last dry pair of gloves they still had. He handed them over silently. It took Micah nearly 2 hours to reach Pike Ranch through the buried valley. Several times, the snow rose past his waist, where canyon wind had stacked the drifts against fence lines and collapsed sheds. He used the iron mattock ahead of every step, probing through hidden ice crust and buried debris before trusting his weight forward. By the time the ranch house emerged through the blowing white, Micah already knew something was wrong. No smoke rose from the chimney, not even thin smoke. The front drift reached halfway up the windows. Micah hacked through the packed snow and forced the door inward against a frozen ridge built along the threshold. Cold air rolled out immediately. The fire inside had almost died. Only a few weak coals glowed beneath layers of gray ash, while the room itself sat barely warmer than the storm outside. One dining chair had been chopped apart for fuel. Part of a cabinet lay broken beside the hearth. Frost spread across the interior walls near the corners. Ruth Pike sat wrapped in blankets near the fire pit, trembling so hard the tin cup in her hands rattled constantly. Conrad looked worse. Exhaustion had hollowed him out during the storm. His beard carried frost where his own breath had frozen against it overnight. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Conrad saw the dry wool coat on Micah's shoulders, the clear eyes, the strength still left in him, and understood immediately. "The cave held," he said quietly. Micah nodded once. Ruth lowered her face into both hands after hearing it. Conrad stared toward the dead fire for another long moment, before pushing himself slowly upright. "I ain't taking charity," he muttered. Micah looked at him steadily across the freezing rift, not angry, not triumphant, just tired. "Sarah wouldn't forgive either one of us," he said quietly. "If Eli had to bury more family after this winter." The room went silent, except for wind pressing against the outer walls. At last Conrad reached for his coat hanging beside the door. As Ruth struggled to stand, her eyes caught sight of Eli waiting outside near the sled trail below the porch. The boy stood bundled in dry wool beside Rook, cheeks red from cold but healthy. Alive. For the first time since the storm began, something inside Conrad Pike finally gave way. The climb back to the cave nearly broke what little strength Conrad and Ruth Pike still had left. Snow reached almost to their shoulders, in places where the canyon wind had buried the upper ridge trail. Micah walked ahead with the mattock while Eli stayed behind Ruth, helping steady her whenever drifts shifted beneath her boots. Rook moved silently around them, through the white dark, like an old trail animal that already knew where solid ground remained hidden under the storm. By the time they reached the cave entrance, Ruth could barely lift her feet anymore. Then Micah pulled aside the outer timber barrier. Warm air touched their faces immediately. Not blazing heat, not the suffocating blast of an overheated stoveroom. Something steadier than that. Dry warmth. Stable warmth. The kind that did not fight winter so much as refused to surrender to it. Inside, the cave walls held nearly 60 degrees despite the frozen world outside. Small, controlled flames moved quietly beneath the shale shelf, while heat stored inside the basalt bench continued radiating back into the chamber from fires burned hours earlier. Conrad stopped just inside the throat wall. For several seconds, he said nothing at all. Water buckets remained unfrozen near the rear chamber. Damp gloves hung drying above the line stretched through the stone ceiling supports. Eli's wool coat steamed faintly beside the wall where river stones still carried stored warmth from the previous night. Near the bench, Rook slept beside the boy without trembling once. Micah handed Ruth a bowl of broth before adding another small piece of cedar to the fire. No wasted fuel, no roaring flames. The cave did not survive by fighting the mountain harder than the storm. It survived because Micah had learned how to work with the rules the mountain already followed. Slowly, Conrad stepped toward the basalt bench and rested one rough hand against the stone. Warm, still warm. Even now. His eyes moved across the chamber again after that. The drainage trench, the controlled airflow, the dry blankets, the low-ceiling heat pocket holding warmth close to the sleeping shelf. And for the first time since Sarah Boone died, Conrad Pike fully understood what Micah had actually built inside the mountain. Not a hiding place, not a desperate shelter. A system built carefully enough to carry a child through winter, better than the ranch house below ever had. Road crews did not fully reopen the lower valley trails until nearly 2 weeks after the White Divide storm finally passed. By then, the story had already spread farther than the snow itself. Men arriving at Bitterroot Crossing no longer spoke about Micah Boone with amusement. They spoke carefully now, quietly, like people discussing something they had once judged too quickly. The first visitor to the cave was Nolan Reed. He came carrying split cedar across a hand sled and stopped outside the throat wall as though uncertain whether he still belonged there after disappearing earlier in the winter. Micah simply stepped aside and let him enter. No speech, no accusation. After Nolan came Pastor Eli Mercer with flour, dried beans, and lamp oil packed carefully beneath canvas wrappings. 2 ranch hands followed several days later, bringing repaired iron brackets for the vent supports after hearing how close the shaft had come to freezing shut during the storm. Eventually, even Edna Crowley climbed the ridge. She said very little once inside. Most people did not. The cave itself handled the talking now. Dry warmth moved steadily through the basalt chamber, while wet gloves dried overhead and snowmelt water sat unfrozen beside the stone bench. Outside, the valley still carried scars from the storm. Broken fencing, buried sheds, frozen cattle pulled from drifts. The mountain had tested everything equally, and the mountain had made its decision. One afternoon, Conrad Pike stood near the cave entrance, while several men unloaded wood beside the outer wall. He removed his gloves slowly before speaking. Micah Boone kept us alive in the very place this valley laughed at. Nobody argued. Nobody smiled either. The silence carried too much truth for that. Near the rear chamber, Nolan stacked fresh cedar beside the basalt bench without asking permission first. That more than anything else told Micah the valley had finally changed. Gideon Vale died during the first thaw of spring, while snowmelt water still moved cold beneath the eastern rocks above the basin. Micah buried him on a high basalt slope, facing sunrise, not far from the old vent ridges Gideon used to study whenever weather changed in the mountains. The grave stayed simple. Stone marker, cedar crossbeam, no long sermon. Pastor Mercer spoke only a few words. The wind carried the rest away. Years passed after that winter. The cave remained. At first, it served only Micah Boone and his son. Then travelers began using it during sudden storms crossing the divide. Ranch hands caught in blizzards learned where the Eastern Ridge Shelter stood. Freight teams trapped by whiteout conditions sometimes reached the throat wall half frozen and left alive 2 days later. By the late 1860s, people in the upper Bitterroot Basin no longer called it Micah's Cave. They called it the Storm Shelter. Eli Boone grew into a quiet stone builder with his father's hands and Gideon Vale's patience. He understood airflow before most men understood smoke. He learned how rock stored warmth, how wet ground stole heat, how mountains punished carelessness without warning. Conrad Pike started climbing the ridge nearly every Sunday after church. Once age stiffened his knees enough to keep him off horseback trails. He never arrived empty-handed. Sometimes rope, sometimes beeswax, sometimes replacement tool heads wrapped in cloth. Never apologies. Frontier men rarely spoke that language well. One autumn evening many years later, Micah sat outside the cave entrance listening to wind move through the eastern vent shaft, while Eli explained draft flow to a young boy from the valley below. "The mountain breathes if you let it," Eli said, using almost the exact words Gideon Vale had spoken long ago. Micah looked toward the fading light over the Bitterroot Basin and said nothing. In those mountains, people eventually learned that things called useless were often simply waiting for the right hands to understand them.